Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Thompson, and I'm here to host the Mind series, a new episode tonight. We'll be talking tonight about the ACBs of dyslexia, which means we'll be talking about learning disabilities and how to recognize those individuals and how to evaluate them. With me tonight will be Sherry Titchener, who is our Educational Services Coordinator, who will be talking to you more about her experience and her expertise in this area. So I'd like to introduce her first. Sherry has been working with us now at Mind Matters for how long?
About 2.5 years.
And prior to that, you were working at?
Hazel Fisher School. So I taught there for 25 years, kindergarten and first grade. And before that, I taught all grades, 2nd through 5th, in Yolo County.
So you have lots of experience in working with young individuals who are trying to learn. And what is it that made you want to come work for Mind Matters and bring your expertise to help us in kids who have learning challenges?
Personally, I was really interested in helping kids that were struggling in school. So I had done a lot of studying on my own, trying to have more tools to help them, more strategies. And so I'd been going to brain conferences and being trained as a dyslexia remediation specialist and using those tools in my classroom as much as I could. And then when I had a chance to come work with Mind Matters, I was really excited because I knew I could focus on just that and not having to teach everything, every subject to the whole class, but just helping those individuals that were struggling to learn.
So what kind of things when you were a classroom teacher that you noticed that you wanted to go back and find about the brain-based behaviors? What kind of struggles were you noticing in the kids?
Where they weren't learning to do the skills that they needed to progress, no matter what activities I'd give them, and no matter how hard they'd work or how much homework their parents were doing with them. And so I knew it wasn't a matter of effort. They were usually bright kids. You could tell by their conversation, by their vocabulary, by how fast they learned different science concepts or caught on to social studies concepts, that they were bright kids. But they were just having so many problems with decoding words or getting their rate up or their fluency up. A lot of times it was spelling. They would do fine maybe on a spelling test, but then they couldn't remember how to spell the words when they wrote. Or it'd be time to write and they'd just sit there and not be able to think of anything to write. They just couldn't make the words flow, that kind of thing.
So these were really bright, motivated kids that for some reason couldn't do what they needed to do to accomplish much in the classroom. So you learned some of the techniques early on, even before coming to Mind Matters. Did some of those techniques help you in the classroom?
They did. The staff at Hazel Fisher was all trained. They took the whole staff to brain-based learning conferences, and it helped our teaching to be much more effective. And so it did meet my needs a lot of ways, but I kept hearing that Mind Matters was doing more intensive treatments for the kids, and I wanted to know about that. I wanted to be able to offer that to kids.
So when you say brain-based conferences, that sounds like an interesting concept. I don't know if everybody would understand what that is. What's the bias with a brain-based conference? What does it mean?
So all learning takes place in the brain. So you might think, why would teachers need to go to a brain-based conference? Because teachers are trained to teach, right, to help kids learn.
Right.
But a lot of times the subjects that we're taught to teach were given the textbooks and told to teach according to this outline and the synopsis for this book and get through all the chapters. And that's the focus. You have to teach this curriculum and this curriculum and this curriculum, not what does this child need to learn? What do they need to stay motivated, to keep their attention? What kind of strategies do you need to learn to teach to actually make them remember what you're teaching?
So then a classroom teacher typically is trained in a way of managing a group of individuals and delivering a curriculum that's required, but not necessarily given the tools necessarily to know how to address an individual need or an individual variation, somebody who's having a struggle. Is that right?
I think, and part of it is that depending on how long ago you were trained, how long ago you went through your teacher training. So I can't speak for how teachers are trained now. I know Stanislaus County does, when they were credentialing teachers, that they did use, like Jan Alcalde, who's on our board, and I was one of the teachers for their program, and they had us come in and do training, brain-based learning training for the teachers who were trying to qualify and get their certificates. But when I was getting my training, that's more what it was like, that it was more general. And there wasn't as much research done on the brain and applying it. So that's a big difference, is to have the researchers have interpreted it to how it could apply in the classroom.
So the research is then turned into tools to be used in the classroom. How common are learning disabilities? Why is it something we should be concerned about?
So it's very common. There's 5% of students that are already identified with learning disabilities in the schools. So 5%, that's a lot in a class if you think about a classroom. What's startling is how many kids are probably not identified. The research says there's 15 to 20% of children who are struggling in school. They're getting C's and below, but they're not identified. And the supposition is that they probably have some sort of learning disability or subtype of a learning disability that's affecting them.
So I understand that there's some kids who are going to be more severely affected than others. So some kids are going to have a severe learning disability, and they're going to be more easily identified and put into that first category, qualifying in that 5%. But then there's likely to be a whole bunch of kids who aren't severe enough to meet that criteria if the bar is raised too high, yet they really struggle. So again, you're talking about that bright kid who's highly motivated, and in spite of all of their efforts, still is struggling to get a C. So then those are the individuals you're talking about that may be kind of not severe enough to be in that 5%, yet still impacted by it.
Very impacted, and especially where schools have gone to a new method of identifying students that qualify for special education. And the schools have developed a good response to that. It's called RTI, Response to Intervention, and they test all of the students and then identify the ones that are struggling, put them in Tier 2, where they do small groups of intensive intervention with them. And then if they don't respond, some schools will go to Tier 3, or some schools at that point will do further testing. But that's made it so that some of the kids get what they need with response to intervention. But there's some children that then go through months of waiting while these other strategies and methods are tested to see if it'll work. And that's a lot of times where the parents come to us and can tell their child struggling even with the small group help.
So it must be very frustrating for some of those individuals, both the parent and the child.
I think so.
Okay. So the part of the question is, if you're not severe enough to be identified, you're also not severe enough necessarily to get the intensity of help you might need. Okay. Tell me, not everyone here or listening to this program would know what a learning disability is. How would you define a learning disability? If I were to tell you my child has a learning disability, what kind of thing would come to mind?
Well, if you're saying your child has a learning disability, that would say to me that they've been diagnosed, that they've gone to a specialist, a learning specialist, some professional that has done that diagnosis, and that person has done a test to determine what kind of specific learning disability your child has. And a learning disability is a neurological difference, brain difference in their brain structure and their brain function but doesn't have anything to do with your child's intelligence. So there's different kinds of learning disabilities, but one of the main characteristics is that it has to significantly impact their learning.
So you can have a high IQ, normal IQ, and still have a learning disability.
Yes.
So again, that would sound like if somebody had a high or a normal IQ and had a learning disability, that could be pretty frustrating. Knowing that you're smart, but you can't achieve.
Well, for a parent, the parents are usually the ones that have that feeling like, I know my child's smart, because they've watched them learn all kinds of information and skills, maybe outside of the classroom, and listen to them talk and just watch that spark. That spark in their eye, and,
Right. Or
and
you know they're bright.
like
You know
having
they're...
a good sense of humor is one of those characteristics. The child often can't tell that about themselves. They don't know they're smart, actually. The parents can look at it and go, there's a contrast here, there's a problem. The child is smart and they're not succeeding. The child often just feels like they're not smart. They worry that they're dumb and they feel insecure. They don't feel as good as their peers. It's a really rough situation, often starting as soon as they start school. You can see it right away in kindergarten. It doesn't take long for them to look around and see a whole bunch of kids writing and reading and doing all these things easily, and they're still having trouble holding their pencil.
Yeah. So they become frustrated early on and start to recognize that they struggle and start to develop those attitudes about themselves. And
They can have bad attitudes about themselves. Some children react a different way. They become defiant and act like, I'm just not going to do it. Not that they don't want to say they can't.
Right.
They just refuse to do it. Or they become the passive ones, where they just act like they don't care, and it's boring. It's so boring.
yeah, that's what I've heard oftentimes from kids with learning disabilities, that they say reading is boring. Which, when I hear that from a parent with a child with learning disability, I think, okay, boring means it's unmotivating, and if it means it's difficult for me to read, why would I want to do something that's difficult for me to do? So it's like I told a parent today. I said, it's like looking forward to a root canal. Is that something I want to do? Do I want to read? No. Do I want another root canal? No, I don't want another root canal. So I can see why would you want to do something that's in a way painful, something that's really difficult for you. One other thing I hear a lot from parents is they hear about dyslexia, and I think it's a very confusing term for people. They don't always understand the difference between what's a dyslexia, what's a learning disability. And so I want you to, and I know we already talked about this, but what is dyslexia and how is that different?
So learning disability would be the main title, and then under that are different disabilities, and dyslexia is just one of the subtypes of a learning disability. And dyslexia means a difficulty with reading. That's the meaning of the word dyslexia. And if you're going to diagnose dyslexia, then you have to look for a significant, persistent, pervasive difficulty with decoding, like the phonological, phonemic awareness part, also the word attack skills, rate and fluency in reading, can also extend to writing and spelling and math, because it affects all those areas of your memory and your working memory.
Well, I thought dyslexia, and a lot of people would say this, I thought dyslexia just meant you flip B's and D's, and you flip letters and words, and you have mirror image writing. I thought dyslexia was just about turning things around. Is that dyslexia?
That is dyslexia. That's surface dyslexia, and that's the most visible sign of dyslexia. The other signs are not as easy to notice. So that one's right there. It's in black and white, and you can see it. So a lot of people think, that's it. And if my child isn't doing that, then they don't have dyslexia. The thing is, that's just one component of dyslexia, and the other is how their brains manage information and keep information in order. And so that's why they have a lot of times they'll have trouble with matching sound to symbol or memorizing their sight words and keeping them for more than a week or two. So a lot of times parents will work with their kids on spelling or flashcards, and the night before they do the practice and the child has it. And then they go to school and they hear back from the teacher, no, they didn't do it. And the parents are like, they did it at home.
So sometimes parents get angry.
Yes,
With their children.
it's frustrated. They're frustrated. They're trying so hard and they care so much.
So you can have dyslexia and not flip your B's and D's?
Yes,
So, okay.
yes.
So that's not necessarily a way of determining whether or not somebody has dyslexia, is
It's
whether or not they
not
flip their
the
letters.
only way. No, nope,
Okay,
definitely not.
that's good to know. So give me some ideas or some flavors of different types of learning disabilities you see.
Dyslexia is the most common. So
Which means difficulty with reading.
difficulty with reading, yes.
Okay.
It is the most common, most prevalent. What's interesting about kids with dyslexia too is that a large percentage of them also have other conditions that make their learning difficult. So a number of them will also have attention problems, focusing problems, ADHD, ADD. They'll have auditory processing disorder or visual processing. They can have reduced working memory. They can have motor skill difficulty. So dyslexia is the most common. And then under that, other subtypes would be dysgraphia, so inability to write, either difficulty just holding the pencil or writing the letters fluidly, or writing sentences or paragraphs. And then there's dyscalculia with math difficulty, learning your math facts or math reasoning. And then we have dyspraxia with motor skills, kids who they're clumsy.
So within learning disabilities, so if this child has a learning disability, it may look very different from this child with learning disability.
Yes, there's like 9 different subcategories.
So you can't necessarily know what to expect when you say this child has a learning disability unless you know more about the type of learning disability.
If you're trying to do remediation, then you need to know which specific learning disability they have.
What's a kid going to look like in a classroom? If I was a classroom teacher, what kind of things would I look for to be suspicious that a child may have a learning disability?
So the first thing is their failure to achieve to their potential. The kind of thing where when you're looking at a child and you feel like saying, they're not achieving to their potential, or if they'd only try harder. That's one clue right there, is to look at it more carefully, because it could be due to a learning disability.
It may not be their effort.
It might not be their effort. And it may be that their effort is reduced because they've experienced so much frustration.
Because they don't want a root canal.
They don't want a root canal. Yes.
Right.
Yes, they're trying to avoid that root canal. So they act like they don't care, and they act like they're not trying, because that's cooler to their peers than to act like they just can't do it. They would much rather have their peers think they are misbehaving than incapable.
So again, kind of from the parent perspective, if I'm a parent, I'm working with my child at home, we're doing homework, when do I think about asking for help or asking for somebody to find out if my child has a learning disability? What kind of things might I notice as a parent sitting down in the evening?
If it takes your child longer than the amount of time that the teacher has told you is reasonable, that's one indicator.
Okay.
If the child is breaking down emotionally, so a lot of parents will report that their children are crying or throwing tantrums about it. So I'd say an emotional breakdown is another. And then if you study with them and they seem to be learning it but can't retain it, that could be another indicator. And then any time where your gut feeling is telling you, this doesn't look right, this doesn't feel right, when your gut's telling you that, then it's a good time to go to the teacher and have a meeting and go over the work and the expectations and find out what's going on from the teacher's point of view.
Okay. So again, from the child's perspective, they're going to notice there's a difference. And you say they first start noticing in kindergarten? That seems pretty young.
They do.
How about later in school? What happens to an individual with learning disability? You never address the concern. What might happen to an individual with learning disability if we don't address the concern, the problem?
So those are the children that often have behavior problems. They're the ones most likely to be sent to the principal for acting out, getting in fights, or showing depression, showing anxiety. And as they get older, they're the ones who often will not want to go to school, pretend to be sick, cut school, and very prone to not graduating from high school, from dropping out. And then not having high expectations for themselves. They're the ones who feel like they can't expect to go to a trade school or a junior college or a college because they're not smart enough. They don't have good expectations for their future.
So there's a significant risk in ignoring the concern, in a sense, then. It's not just a matter of whether or not they can learn now, but what does the future hold for them as far as what do they believe about themselves? Can I be successful? Can I have a good job? Can I ever be anything I want to be? Or do my dreams kind of cut short then because I believe myself? Because usually, as we've talked about before, it's not because they are necessarily just unsuccessful in school, but they think they're dumb.
They do.
And again, they're talking about somebody with a normal IQ and originally can be highly motivated, but then that motivation starts to trail off over time.
It can trail off so that they don't feel the pressure. They just have to blanket out, because otherwise they'll be too anxious, too frustrated. It's too heavy for them.
Okay, so when a child comes to you and you have a suspicion that they may have a learning disability, what process do you go through to find out if they have a learning problem?
So at Mind Matters, when a child comes in, there's a couple of routes. They could come through you. The parents have brought them because they have concerns, maybe about attention issues. And then you would send them to me to check to make sure there's not a learning deficiency. But sometimes parents have heard from teachers or from another parent that this is something that they can have checked out. And we have a test called the RIO, the Receptive Expressive Observation. And one of the beauties of that test is it's very quick compared to the kind of IEP process that goes on in school, or to do the IQ testing. Those tests, the Woodcock-Johnson, that could take an hour and a half. This is more like a survey that can point out many different learning disabilities within. The test only takes 45 minutes. And it looks at the visual and auditory processing and their motor skills. It can point out dyslexia. There's ways that it triggers our attention to notice if the child is anxious or has problems with impulsivity, with hyperactivity, with lack of attention, even if they have autism spectrum disorder kind of behaviors. All of those things can be noticed in this initial survey. And then we score that, find their pattern of errors, find their percentile for how well they're processing. Mm-hmm. And then we would go from there. We don't just look at the test, we talk to the parents, find out the school history, family history, make sure there's no emotional things going on that we need to know about, or post-traumatic stress disorder kind of things from their background. Mm-hmm. So we look at all that information, and then we can make a decision about what disability or disorder they seem to have.
So just for an example, if you found a child had an auditory processing disorder, does that mean they can't hear?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you hear auditory and you think, okay, it has to do with your ears. And if a child can't hear well or didn't hear well when they were an infant or a young child, it can affect their learning capacity. But for an auditory processing disorder, that's the information that goes in, and they need to be able to hear it with good efficiency. And then how well they can process it. Can they keep it in short-term memory long enough to work with it? And so no, it's not about whether they can hear it, just like visual processing disorder is how well they can process it. Does it go along the pathways from where it enters the brain as one of your senses to where you can process it, you can make a picture with it of the object, you know, of the cat, or you can make a picture of the word cat and kind of see the letters in your head, and so that you can remember it.
Could an auditory processing disorder ever cause difficulties in things that have nothing to do with sound?
Yes, yes. So, for example, someone with an auditory processing disorder might not be able to follow directions well. And those directions could be their parents telling them, go upstairs, I want you to put on your shoes, remember to bring your soccer ball, and grab your dirty clothes on the way back down because I want to put in a load of laundry. Okay?
Yeah.
And they come back down and they have their shoes on. They did the first thing on the list. And you're going crazy as a parent, what about the rest of the things? And
You heard me, how come you didn't do it?
Right.
Right.
And it just did not stick, or sometimes they'll do just the last thing. We see it a lot in the classroom where you're doing an art project, for example, and you're giving specific instruction about where to put the pieces to make a panda. You know, you're going to put the eyes here and the ears here, you're doing this. And then you come up and a child will have something where it's all different places, different order, different places. It's not that they were trying to be defiant. It's that it didn't go in and get processed.
So they didn't get the instructions right.
No.
Okay, so it's not a matter of motivation, it's not a matter of effort or IQ, but if they don't get the instructions right, and so I always picture they got 2 out of 3 pieces of the instruction and they can do exactly what they heard, yet they're still not going to be successful in doing it.
Exactly.
So then in a sense what I'm understanding is if you have a child that you think is struggling and it doesn't make sense to you, and as you said, kind of using that gut instinct, if they're having emotional difficulties when it comes to homework time, they're having trouble remembering their spelling words, they're having trouble with their reading, at least consider the question of whether or not they could have a learning disability. And if you do have a question, then you can bring it up with their teacher, or you can consider having them come to Mind Matters or elsewhere. There's other resources that are out there. But I guess the big thing I always try to remember is if you have a suspicion and that you don't address the concern, if you came and you got evaluated and it wasn't a learning disability, at least you've asked the question. If you see a child is struggling, why presume it's due to the lack of motivation? So that's a good thing to remember. So in part 2, we'll be talking more about the treatment of learning disabilities. So thank you very much for listening.